The year was 1875, and the Montana Territory bit at the edges of civilization with teeth of wind and stone. The stagecoach, a bone-weary vessel of wood and leather, finally surrendered its momentum in the center of Whitetail Creek, a town that seemed less built and more clawed out of the valley floor. Dust, the color of old wheat, rose in a fine mist, coating everything, including the inside of Elena Zimmerman's lungs. For 1,000 miles, she had dreamed of this moment, and now that it was here, all she felt was a profound and aching thirst. She waited for the other passengers to disembark, a small courtesy that gave her a moment to smooth the wrinkles from her gray traveling dress and compose her features. At 36, she was a master of composure. It was a shield forged in the East, in a world that had politely informed her, through a series of closing doors and pitying glances, that her time for new beginnings had expired. This journey was her last act of defiance against that quiet verdict. The mountains stood guard at the horizon, their peaks a distant, bruised purple above the endless sweep of grassland, which was itself scarred by shadow and light, as if a great blade had been scraped across it. Whitetail Creek was not much more than a single street flanked by false-fronted buildings, their raw lumber already bleached by the sun. It was a place of harsh lines and little softness. Elena held the letter in her gloved hand. The paper was softened with rereading. The ink a faded promise. Mr. Colton Yancey. His words had been spare but decent. He owned a cattle ranch. He had written. He had served in the war. He was 43 and sought a partner to build a life with, someone of good character and steady disposition. He had not asked for her age, and she had not offered it. A hand, calloused and grimy, reached up to help her down. "Here you are, ma'am," the driver grunted, his breath smelling of stale coffee. "Welcome to the end of the line." Elena's feet touched the ground, and she felt a tremor of unsteadiness, whether from the long journey or the sheer weight of her own hope. She could not say. A small cluster of townspeople had gathered, their curiosity a palpable force. They watched her as they might watch a new breed of horse being unloaded, their eyes cataloging her worn boots, her simple bonnet, the lines of fatigue around her eyes. It was then that a man stumbled out of the building marked Post. He was thick in the belly and red in the face, and he held a half-empty bottle by its neck. His gaze, bleary but sharp with a drunkard's mischief, landed on the letter in Elena's hand. "Well now, what's this?" he slurred, pointing with the bottle. "That the mail I delivered last spring from one Colton Yancey." Elena clutched the letter tighter. "It is, sir." The man let out a great, wheezing laugh that shook his whole frame. "Should have saved yourself the trip, ma'am." He took a swig from the bottle and wiped his mouth on his sleeve. "That letter ain't for you. Heard it straight from the man himself. Yancey said there'd been a mistake. Said he sent it to the wrong person." The words struck Elena with the physical force of a slap. The world seemed to tilt, the dusty street dissolving at the edges. A ripple of snickers went through the onlookers. A woman in a fine calico dress, her face pinched with smug satisfaction, whispered something to her companion, and they both laughed behind their hands. The sound was like breaking glass. Wrong person. The phrase echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of her mind. All those weeks of careful saving, of selling the last of her mother's furniture, of stitching clothes suitable for a new life, of enduring the cramped, rattling stagecoach, all of it had been built on a mistake. She was a fool. A 36-year-old fool who had crossed a continent chasing a ghost. She could feel the blood draining from her face, her carefully constructed composure crumbling into dust. She wanted to turn, to climb back into the stagecoach and command it to take her back, but her feet felt as though they were nailed to the Montana soil. The crowd's amusement was a hot, suffocating blanket. They saw her not as a person, but as a spectacle. The old bride. Come all this way for nothing. From the end of the street came the steady, rhythmic sound of a horse's walk. The crowd's attention shifted, their murmurs changing in tone. A man on a tall bay horse approached, moving with an unhurried grace that seemed to calm the very air around him. He was lean and broad-shouldered, dressed in practical denim and worn leather. The sun had weathered his face, carving lines around his eyes that spoke of long hours spent looking toward the horizon. He drew his horse to a halt without a word, his gaze sweeping over the scene, taking in the drunken mail carrier, the smirking crowd, and finally, the lone woman standing frozen beside the stagecoach. This had to be him, Colton Yancey. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of despair. He would turn away. He would ride on, leaving her to her public humiliation. It was what any sensible man would do. He swung down from the saddle in one fluid motion. The bay stood ground, untethered, a testament to its training and its trust in its master. He did not look at the mail carrier or the mayor's wife, a woman Elena would come to know as Agnes Dunham, whose sharp eyes were now fixed on him, daring him to confirm the joke. His focus was entirely on Elena. He walked toward her, his boot heels making a soft, deliberate sound in the dust. The space between them shrank until he was standing before her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray at his temples and the quiet intensity in his dark eyes. He saw the tremor in her hand, the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes, the proud, desperate set of her jaw. He saw all the years she carried, not as a burden, but as a part of her story. The whispers from the crowd had died to a tense, expectant silence. Mrs. Dunham watched with a thin, predatory smile. From the porch of the saloon across the street, another man observed the proceedings with a different kind of interest. He was a large, imposing figure, his expensive hat and tailored coat setting him apart. This man, Vaughn Tate, was not interested in the social drama. He was watching Colton Yancey, gauging the man's response, filing it away. Colton did not speak. Instead, he reached out and gently took Elena's hand. His palm was rough with calluses, the skin thick from work and weather, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He enclosed her trembling fingers in his, a silent anchor in the swirling vortex of her shame. The warmth of his hand was real, solid. He looked from her face to the crowd, his expression unreadable, but his voice, when he finally spoke, was clear and steady enough to carry to every corner of the street. It was not a loud voice, but it commanded attention. "You're timeless to me." The words fell into the silence, simple and profound. The mail carrier's drunken grin faltered. Agnes Dunham's smile vanished, replaced by a look of sharp annoyance, as if a favored game had been spoiled. Vaughn Tate, on his porch, narrowed his eyes, a flicker of something that might have been respect, or perhaps just calculation, crossing his features. He saw a man who would not be easily intimidated, a man who stood by his choices, even when they were inconvenient. And a man like that, Tate knew, could be a problem, especially when he stood between you and the water you needed to expand your own empire. The laughter was gone. The moment of cruel sport was over, broken by two hands joined and four simple words. Colton gave Elena's hand a slight, reassuring squeeze before releasing it. "My wagon is just yonder," he said, his voice now low and meant only for her. "We can fetch your things from the store." He gestured with his chin toward the General Mercantile. He did not wait for her reply, but turned and began walking, trusting her to follow. And after a moment's hesitation, a single, deep breath that was half sob, half revival, Elena Zimmerman did. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked away from the staring crowd and toward the man who had just built a shield around her with nothing more than his presence and his word. The ground beneath her feet felt a little more solid now. The future was still a vast, terrifying unknown. But for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, it no longer felt like a mistake. It felt like a beginning. The wagon ride to the ranch was a silent affair, but it was a silence of a different quality than the one that had gripped the town. This was a quiet of vast, open spaces, of the wind whispering through dry grass, and of two people taking measure of one another. The town and its petty cruelties fell away behind them with every turn of the wheels. Elena sat straight on the hard wooden seat, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the endless horizon. She felt Colton Yancey's presence beside her, solid and steady. He did not press her for conversation, for which she was grateful. Her thoughts were a tangled mess of humiliation and a fragile, flickering ember of something she dared not name. After they had traveled for some miles, with only the creak of the wagon and the plod of the horses for company, he finally spoke, his voice calm and even. "I owe you an apology. Mrs. Zimmerman," he said, not looking at her but at the dusty track ahead. "What happened back there was not right. No person should be made to feel a spectacle." Elena found her voice, though it was thinner than she would have liked. "You are not responsible for the town's lack of manners, Mr. Yancey." "Maybe not, but I brought you here. That makes me responsible for your welcome." He pulled the horses to a gentle stop. The world was suddenly still and quiet. He turned on the seat to face her, his expression serious. "This is not how I intended for this to begin. My letter was sincere. I imagine you are thinking you made a terrible mistake in coming all this way." She met his gaze directly. Honesty seemed to be the only currency that held value out here. "The thought has crossed my mind." A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "I cannot say I blame you. So I want to make you a proposition. You came here to see if a life could be made. I would still like to give you that chance. Come to the ranch, stay for 10 days, see the work, see the land. See me for who I am when I am not in the middle of a town's foolishness. If at the end of those 10 days, you decide this life is not for you, or that I am not the man you thought, I will not hold you to any promise. I will pay for your ticket back to the East, and no one will think less of you for it. It will be my expense to bear for this poor beginning." Elena was stunned. She had expected him to retract his offer, to make an excuse, to send her back on the next stagecoach. Instead, he was offering her dignity. He was offering her a choice, freely given, with no risk to her but a little more of her time. The defensive walls she had so carefully constructed around her heart lowered. Just a fraction. This was a man of fairness, a man of character. It was more than she had hoped for. "That is a very generous offer, Mr. Yancey," she said slowly. "It is a fair one," he corrected gently. "What do you say, Mrs. Zimmerman?" She looked out at the vast, intimidating landscape. It was a land that promised nothing but hardship. Yet, sitting beside this quiet, respectful man, she felt a flicker of hope ignite. To try and fail was one thing. To flee without even trying was another. She had not come this far to be defeated by gossip. "I say yes, Mr. Yancey," she said, her voice firm now. "I will accept your 10 days." He simply nodded, a look of quiet relief in his eyes, and clicked the reins. The horses moved forward again, and Elena felt that she was not retreating from the past, but moving, cautiously, into a possible future. His ranch was nestled in a shallow curve of the valley, a small but sturdy house built of cottonwood logs, a barn, and a web of corrals. It was a place built for function, not for beauty, yet there was an honest handsomeness to it. It was clean, well tended, but it lacked a certain warmth. It was a shelter, not yet a home. The first 3 days passed in a quiet routine. Colton was gone from before sunup to after sundown, riding the long fences of his property, tending to his small herd of cattle. Elena set about making the house her own. She scrubbed the floors, washed the windows until they sparkled, and organized the kitchen. She found a crate of books in a corner, covered in a fine layer of dust. There were works of history, volumes of Shakespeare, and manuals on agriculture and irrigation. She cleaned each one and arranged them on a set of shelves, and in doing so, felt a connection to the man who read them. On the 4th day, the sky turned a strange, bruised yellow. The wind, which had been a constant companion, began to howl, picking up speed and fury. Colton rode in early, his face grim. "Dust storm," he said, his voice tight. "We need to secure the animals." Elena followed him out into the shrieking wind. Dust and grit filled the air, stinging her eyes and coating her throat. The world was reduced to a blinding, roaring haze. They worked together, their movements economical and urgent, herding the chickens into the coop and ensuring the horses were safe in the barn. When the last door was barred, they stumbled back into the house, gasping for air, the wind tearing at the log walls like a living beast. The storm raged for a full day. When it finally passed, it left a world transformed. A layer of fine silt covered everything. A long section of fence on the north pasture had been torn down. The posts snapped like twigs. And when Colton went to the well, he returned with a grim look. The water level had dropped. The storm had choked it with sand. "It is always something," he said, his voice heavy with a fatigue that went beyond tired muscles. "This land, it gives, but it always demands something in return." The next day, they rode into town for supplies to repair the fence. It was Elena's first time back since her arrival. She felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach, but she held her head high as they pulled up to the Jenkinses' General Mercantile. Inside, the store was a wonderland of goods. From bolts of fabric and barrels of flour to shiny new tools and sacks of coffee beans, a pleasant-looking man with a tidy mustache and kind eyes greeted them. "Colton, ma'am." This was Herbert Jenkins. His wife, Martha, a woman with a warm, open face and flour on her apron, came out from the back. Her eyes went to Elena, and there was no pity or malice in them, only genuine curiosity and a welcoming smile. "It is good to see you again, Mrs. Zimmerman. I hope you're settling in well." "I am, thank you," Elena replied, surprised by the woman's warmth. While Colton and Herbert discussed the price of fence posts and wire, Martha engaged Elena in conversation. "It is a hard life out here, but a good one. It takes a strong woman." She patted Elena's arm. "We have a small sewing circle that meets on Wednesdays. Just a few of the ladies from the area. It is a nice way to pass an afternoon. You would be very welcome to join us." The invitation was a lifeline, a chance to be seen as more than the subject of town gossip. "I would like that very much. Mrs. Jenkins." "Please, call me Martha." As they were finishing their business, the door opened and two men walked in. The first was Deputy Harlan Pike, the town's lawman. He was young, with a serious face and an air of someone trying to carry a weight too heavy for his shoulders. He nodded to Colton. "Yancey." Then his eyes flickered to Elena with a hint of awkwardness before he moved on. The second man was Dr. Emil Miller. He was older, with a gruff demeanor and eyes that seemed to see right through a person. He grunted a greeting to the room at large, bought a pouch of tobacco, and left without another word. A man of few pleasantries. Elena gathered, but Colton had told her he was the best doctor in 3 territories. Their errands finished. They loaded the wagon and were about to leave when Deputy Pike approached them. He shifted his feet, looking uncomfortable. "Colton, I need a word with you." He glanced at Elena. "In private, if you do not mind." Colton's expression tightened. He helped Elena up onto the wagon seat. "I will be just a moment." She watched as the two men spoke, their voices too low to hear. The deputy gestured vaguely to the east, toward the land that bordered Colton's ranch. Colton's posture became rigid, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. After a few minutes, the deputy clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture that seemed both official and sympathetic, and walked away. Colton returned to the wagon, his face like a thundercloud. He climbed onto the seat and took up the reins without a word. The silence on the ride back was heavy and fraught with a tension that had not been there before. That evening, after a supper that neither of them touched, He finally told her what the deputy had said. He stood by the window, looking out at the gathering dark. "Vaughn Tate has bought the old Millerstead place," he said, his voice flat, "the piece of land that borders mine along the creek." Elena waited. She knew there was more. The man who owned it before, Miller, he left in a hurry last year, owed money all over. Tate bought up his debt from the bank, and with it, the deed to the land. Colton turned from the window, and his eyes were hard. "And now he is making a claim. He says my deed is not valid. The survey marker that sets my boundary along the creek, he says it was lost in a flood 5 years ago. He says without that marker, there is no proof that the creek runs on my land. He is claiming it as his own." The implication was immediate and devastating. Whitetail Creek was the lifeblood of the ranch. It watered the cattle, the horses, the small garden Elena had just started to plan. Without it, the ranch would wither and die. "Can he do that?" Elena asked, her voice barely a whisper. "He can try," Colton said grimly. "Tate has money and influence. He can tie this up in court for years. A circuit judge only comes through twice a year. In the meantime, he can choke us out. Without that water, I have nothing." The air in the small cabin felt thick, suffocating. The threat was no longer the impersonal cruelty of nature, but the calculated greed of a man. The struggle for survival had just been given a face, and its name was Vaughn Tate. Elena looked at Colton, at the weary lines on his face, at the coiled anger in his stance, the impulse to retreat, to take his generous offer and flee back to the predictable miseries of the East, was strong. But then she looked around the small, simple room. She saw the clean floors, the tidy shelves of books, the beginnings of order she had brought. In the yard, the spot she had picked out for her garden lay waiting for seeds. And she looked at the gentle mare he had given her to ride, a placid, older horse named Daisy, who had patiently carried her on her first awkward attempts to learn to sit a saddle. It was a small thing, but it was a beginning. She had started to put down roots, however shallow. To run now felt like a betrayal, not just of this man, but of herself. She stood up and walked over to the dry sink where she had placed a jar of wildflowers that morning. She touched a petal, its velvety texture a small, soft thing in a world of harsh edges. "Mr. Yancey," she said, her voice clear and steady, "you will need help to fight this." He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. "Show me the maps you have," she said, "and tell me everything you remember about where that marker used to be. My father was a cartographer's assistant. I know how to read a survey." She took a breath. "We will find a way." In that moment, something shifted between them. She was no longer a guest staying for a 10-day trial. She was a partner, standing her ground against the coming storm. The 10-day trial period became an unspoken memory, fading into the relentless rhythm of life on the ranch. Each day was a lesson. Elena learned the particular pull and rhythm of milking the lone dairy cow, her city-softened hands slowly toughening to the task. She learned the geography of the land not from a map, but from the saddle of the gentle mare, Daisy. Colton rode with her at first, his instructions spare but clear, pointing out the low places where water gathered after a rain and the high ridges where the wind bit the hardest. The world, which had once seemed a terrifying, undifferentiated expanse of brown and blue, began to resolve into a place of distinct features and character. It was a demanding land, but it was honest in its demands. He taught her to use the rifle that rested above the fireplace. It was a heavy, serious piece of equipment, and Elena was clumsy with it at first. "This is not for sport," Colton told her, his hands guiding hers on the stock, his voice low and close to her ear. "And not for men, unless you have no other choice. This is to make a wolf think twice before it gets too interested in a newborn calf. It is a tool for making a loud, convincing argument from a distance. You aim high, into the air. The sound is usually enough." The rifle's kick was a hard, surprising blow against her shoulder. but the feeling of being able to make such a definitive sound in the vast silence was not unwelcome. It was a feeling of self-reliance. Their days were spent in shared labor, but their evenings were spent over the maps, spread on the rough-hewn table under the glow of a kerosene lamp. The faded lines and spidery script told the story of the land. Elena's mind, accustomed to detail and order, proved sharp. She traced the surveyor's marks, read the legal descriptions, and listened as Colton recounted his memories of the property line, of the great cottonwood that had once stood near the creek before the flood had washed its roots away. It was during these quiet sessions that a new kind of intimacy grew between them, one born of shared purpose and mutual respect. He saw the keen intelligence behind her quiet demeanor, and she saw the thoughtful, methodical man beneath the weathered, taciturn exterior. Still, the ghost of the town's laughter haunted the edges of her peace. Each night, before blowing out her lamp, she would open a small, leather-bound journal and write a few lines, her pen scratched across the page, a quiet confession in the vast stillness. He spoke to me today of crop rotation. He listened when I suggested a better place to build the cold cellar. He treats me as his equal, yet I see my face in the mirror and I see the truth of my years. I must remember that I was chosen for my character, for a steady hand. I must not ask for more than that. The fear was a quiet, persistent ache, the fear that she was a practical solution to a problem, not the answer to a man's heart. Colton, for his part, fought his own ghosts. There were moments when he would watch Elena hanging laundry on the line, the wind whipping the clean sheets around her, and a shadow would cross his face. He would see another woman, another time. Sarah. Her name was a wound he never touched. She had been bright and full of laughter, and she had been stolen from him by a fever that burned through the mountains one brutal summer. He had built this ranch for her, and she had never seen it finished. He had locked his heart away after that, believing it was the only way to keep it safe. Now, this quiet, capable woman was bringing his house, and some dormant part of himself, back to life, and the feeling was equal parts comfort and terror. To hope again was to invite the possibility of loss again, and so he held a part of himself back, a silent, guarded distance that Elena could feel but not understand. As Martha Jenkins had promised, an invitation to the weekly sewing circle arrived, delivered by Herbert when he brought a delivery of supplies. Elena accepted with a mixture of trepidation and resolve. She wore her best day dress, a simple blue cotton, and rode Daisy into town. The gathering was at the mayor's house, a large two-story home that spoke of prosperity and position. Agnes Dunham presided over the affair like a queen holding court. A few women, Martha among them, greeted Elena warmly. Others offered polite but cool nods, their eyes assessing, their needles never ceasing their rhythmic stitching. Agnes Dunham smiled a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Mrs. Zimmerman," she said, her voice carrying across the parlor. "How good of you to join us. We were just discussing Mrs. Peterson's new baby. It must be a great comfort to know you are past the age of such difficulties." The remark, sharp and perfectly aimed, silenced the room. Elena felt the familiar hot blush of shame creep up her neck, but before she could reply, a young woman, the very Mrs. Peterson in question, spoke up, her voice worried. "Actually, Agnes, I'm quite concerned. Little Thomas has been feverish all morning, and Dr. Miller is out at the old Johnson place, tending to a broken leg." Elena looked at the young mother's anxious face and forgot her own discomfort. "What are his symptoms?" she asked gently. "He is hot to the touch and will not take any milk," Mrs. Peterson fretted. "Do you have any willow bark in your pantry?" Elena asked. "And some chamomile." Agnes Dunham scoffed. "We need a doctor, not some backwoods poultice." But Mrs. Peterson was desperate. "I think so," she said, and led Elena to the kitchen. Under Elena's calm instruction, they brewed a weak tea from the willow bark and chamomile flowers. Elena took a clean cloth, dipped it in cool water, and showed the young mother how to sponge the baby's forehead and wrists. My mother always said a fever must be respected, not feared, Elena explained quietly. You comfort the body, keep it cool, and let it do its work. She stayed for another hour, not in the parlor with the sewing circle, but in the nursery, speaking in low, reassuring tones to the young mother. By the time she left, the baby's fever had eased slightly, and he was sleeping peacefully. Mrs. Peterson walked her to the door, her eyes full of gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you so much. As Elena rode away, she knew that something had shifted. She had not won over Agnes Dunham, but she had earned the respect of a mother. And in a town like Whitetail Creek, that was a currency of far greater value. The conflict with Vaughn Tate, however, was not so easily soothed. A few days later, Colton asked Elena to ride the boundary line with him. It was a clear, crisp morning, and the land felt peaceful. But as they neared the section that ran along the creek, Colton pulled his horse to a sudden stop. He pointed, there. A wooden survey stake, which should have been driven deep into the ground, lay on its side in the tall grass. A little farther on, they found another, and then another. They had been deliberately pulled up, the holes in the earth still fresh. A cold, hard anger settled on Colton's face. His hands tightened on the reins. His men, he said, his voice a low growl. They must have come in the night. He is trying to provoke you, Elena said, her own heart pounding. He wants you to ride over to his ranch with a gun. He wants a fight he knows he can win. Colton's jaw was tight, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He was a man who had seen war. The impulse to meet aggression with force was a deeply ingrained instinct. But he looked at Elena, at her calm, worried face, and he remembered their late-night talks over the maps, their careful strategy. A brawl would solve nothing and would only make him look like the aggressor in the eyes of the law. He took a slow, deep breath, letting the anger recede. You are right, he said, his voice strained but controlled. We gather evidence. We do this the right way. He sent word to Deputy Harlan Pike. The deputy rode out the next day, his face grim as he examined the scene. He knelt, pointing to the ground near the creek bed. Horseshoe prints, he said. And they are not from your animals. Colton, these are shod horses, Tate's men. He stood and sighed, pushing his hat back on his head. I know it, and you know it. But knowing and proving are two different things. Without a witness, it is just your word against his. Tate will say it was youngsters, or wanderers. The deputy looked at Colton with a troubled expression. I am sorry. Colton, I will file a report, but my hands are tied until he makes a more open move. That evening, the silence in the cabin was different. It was not a silence of peace or of two people getting to know one another. It was the heavy, watchful silence of a coming storm. The forces arrayed against them were no longer just whispers and rumors. They had taken physical form. The enemy had crossed their land and declared his intentions without speaking a word. As Elena wrote in her journal that night, her hand was not quite steady. The stakes are no longer just posts in the ground. It feels as though someone is trying to pull up the very roots we are trying to put down. The summer bled into a dry, brittle autumn. The sky remained a relentless, pale blue, empty of clouds. The land grew thirsty, the grass curing to the color of old bone, and the earth itself seemed to sigh dust with every gust of wind. The most alarming change was in Whitetail Creek. The lively ribbon of water that was the ranch's artery dwindled, slowing to a crawl, leaving exposed banks of cracked mud. The deeper pools where the cattle drank shrank daily, and the animals grew restless and thin, their lowing a constant, mournful complaint. The pressure coiled in Colton, making him quieter, his face etched with a deeper worry. He spent his days riding the creek bed, searching for new springs that were not there, his frustration a silent, simmering thing. The ranch, his life's work, was being strangled, and there was nothing he could do. It was during a trip to town for salt licks that Vaughn Tate made his move. He did not send a man. He approached Colton himself as he was leaving the mercantile, positioning himself so Colton could not pass. Tate was a man who took up space, his bulk and expensive clothes a statement of power. "Yancey," he began, his voice smooth and reasonable. "I hear you are having trouble with the water. A man cannot run a herd without water." Colton's hands tightened on the reins of his horse. "My troubles are my own." "Tate." "Nonsense. We are neighbors. Neighbors ought to help each other." Tate smiled, a predatory expression that did not touch his cold eyes. "I have a proposal for you. My section of the creek is still running deep. I would be willing to let you run your cattle on my side, let them drink their fill. We could even rig a sluice to divert some of the flow your way for a time." Colton watched him, his face impassive. He knew a trap when he saw one. "What is your price?" "Just a small legal matter," Tate said, waving a dismissive hand. "A simple document. You sign a paper acknowledging that the primary water rights to the Whitetail headwaters belong to my property. Given the confusion over the boundary markers, it is just a formality. To protect my own interests, you sign, and your cattle can drink today." It was a masterful temptation, the solution to his most pressing problem, offered freely. All it would cost was his future. To sign would be to surrender his claim forever, to put his entire ranch at the mercy of this man's whim. The insult of it was as sharp as the desperation of his situation. "Go to hell, Tate," Colton said, his voice low and shaking with contained fury. He pulled his horse's head around and rode out of town without a backward glance, the hollow feeling in his gut a cold counterpoint to the heat of his anger. When he told Elena what had happened, she saw the despair behind his rage. He paced the small cabin like a caged animal. "He is trying to break me," he said. "He wants to see me fail, so he can pick up the pieces for pennies on the dollar." Elena did not offer empty platitudes. She let him pace. And when his anger had burned itself down to embers of weary frustration, she went to the bookshelf. She pulled down the heavy volume on agriculture and the slim manual on irrigation. She spread the property maps on the table, the ones they had studied so many times, and lit another lamp. "There," she said, her finger tracing a contour line on the map. "The land slopes here, just after the bend. Not much, but it is a slope. The creek bed is lowest on our side in that spot." She opened the irrigation manual, pointing to a diagram of a simple diversion channel. "We cannot make the creek give us more water, but perhaps we can be wiser with what it does give us." Colton stopped pacing and looked at her, at the map, at the book. Hope was a dangerous thing, but the intelligence and practicality of her idea were undeniable. "We could dig a trench," she continued, her voice gaining confidence. "Lead what is left of the stream away from the main channel and into that low-lying area. It would create a pool, a reservoir. It would not be much, but it might be enough to see the herd through until the rains come." For the next week, they worked under the punishing sun. The digging was brutal, back-breaking labor. The ground was hard as iron, and their shovels seemed to make frustratingly little progress. They worked in a shared, sweat-soaked silence, a team bound by a single, desperate purpose. Elena's hands, which had just begun to harden, were now blistered and raw, but she never complained. She matched him swing for swing, her determination a quiet, formidable force. As they toiled, they carved more than a ditch into the unyielding earth. They carved a deeper, more profound partnership. They finished on a Saturday. The resulting trench was a modest affair, but when they breached the creek bank, a trickle of precious water flowed into it, snaking its way down the gentle slope and beginning to form a muddy pool in the depression they had cleared. It was a victory, small but essential. They stood side by side, covered in dirt and grime, and watched the water flow. Colton looked at Elena, at her sunburned face and the determined set of her jaw, and he felt a surge of admiration so powerful it almost stole his breath. The reprieve, however, was short-lived. That night, Elena was awakened by a strange, flickering orange light against the window. She sat up, her heart suddenly pounding. A smell, acrid and sharp, was in the air. Smoke. She threw on a robe and ran outside. Colton was already there, a silhouette against a terrifyingly bright horizon. A line of fire was eating its way across the dry prairie, a hungry orange beast consuming everything in its path, and it was moving directly toward them. The wind, their constant, fickle companion, was pushing it on. "The hay barn!" Colton yelled over the roar, his voice tight with panic. If the barn caught, with its stores of dry winter feed, it would go up like a torch, and the house would be next. There was no time to think, only to act. Adrenaline surged through Elena, cold and sharp, while Colton hitched a terrified horse to the plow, intending to cut a fire break. Elena ran for the house. She grabbed every blanket, every quilt, every heavy piece of fabric she could find and dragged them to the well. Her arms screamed with the effort of drawing bucket after bucket of their precious water, soaking the heavy wool until she could barely lift it. She met Colton at the edge of the yard. He was carving a deep, dark line in the earth with the plow, a desperate scar meant to starve the fire of its fuel. The heat was immense, a physical blow. Embers, carried on the wind, rained down around them like malevolent stars. "Here," she shouted, handing him a dripping, heavy blanket. They worked like demons in the hellish light. They beat at the smaller fires that leaped across the plow line, using the wet blankets to smother the flames. The smoke was a thick, choking blanket, clawing at their lungs, making their eyes stream. Soot blackened their faces and their clothes. They were a pair of frantic, desperate figures, fighting for their lives, for their home, against an elemental force of destruction. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the roar of the fire, the searing heat, and the rhythmic, exhausting slap of wet wool against burning grass. Slowly, agonizingly, they began to win. The main fire front reached the fire break and, finding no fuel, faltered. They beat back the last of the encroaching flames, their movements becoming slower, heavier, as exhaustion set in. Finally, the last flame was extinguished. The fire moved on, past them, a terrible orange river flowing away into the night. They were left in a world of darkness, smoke, and the eerie red glow of the distant blaze. The air was thick with the smell of scorched earth. They stood in the blackened, smoking field, and the strength that had sustained them through the fight drained away in an instant, leaving them weak and trembling. Elena looked at Colton. His face was a mask of soot, his eyes wide in the gloom. He was shaking, not from cold, but from the violent aftermath of adrenaline. She realized she was shaking too, her whole body trembling uncontrollably. He took a step toward her, then another, until he was standing in front of her. Without a word, he reached out and pulled her against him. It was not an embrace of passion, but of sheer, desperate relief. She buried her face in his smoky shirt, her arms wrapping around his solid frame as if to anchor herself to the world. He held her tightly, his head resting on hers, his body trembling just as hers was. They stood like that for a long time, two survivors clinging to one another in the ruins, the only sound the ragged gasps of their own breathing and the distant, dying crackle of the fire. Finally, he spoke, his voice a raw whisper against her hair. "I was afraid," he admitted, the words ragged and torn from him. "I was afraid of losing all of this. Everything I've built." He drew a shuddering breath. "Everything I was just starting to have." Tears she had not realized she was holding back began to stream down her face, cutting clean paths through the soot on her cheeks. "I was afraid too," she whispered back. He pulled back just enough to look down at her, his hands still resting on her arms. In the strange, dim light, his face was stripped of all its usual defenses. She saw his fear, his vulnerability, and something else, something deep and true. The walls he had built around his heart, the ones erected in the shadow of a past loss, crumbled to dust in that moment. The careful distance he had maintained was gone, burned away by the fire. He was looking at her not as a partner in work, but as the woman he could not bear to lose. "Elena," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it, in his rough voice, was a revelation. "I do not want to face another day of this life without knowing you are by my side, not just as a partner, but as my wife." He searched her eyes, his own full of a question he did not need to speak. "Let's go see the preacher," he said, his voice gaining a rough sort of certainty. "Next Sunday. Let's make this official. Let's stand together. For good." It was not a romantic proposal whispered in moonlight. It was a commitment forged in smoke and fear and fierce, shared victory. It was real. Elena looked up at him, at this strong, vulnerable man who had faced down fire for her, for them, and her heart, which had been so carefully guarded for so long, finally, completely, opened. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and sure in the smoky darkness. "Yes, Colton, Sunday." The wedding was held in the small wooden chapel at the end of town, a simple structure that smelled of pine sap and dust. The Sunday air was still and cool, carrying the first real hint of the winter to come. News of the impending nuptials had spread through Whitetail Creek like a prairie fire, and the chapel was more full than the preacher had seen it in months. They were not all well-wishers. Elena saw a spectrum of faces as she walked down the short aisle on Herbert Jenkins' arm. She saw the genuine warmth of Martha and the grateful smile of the young Mrs. Peterson, but mostly, she saw the flat, unblinking stare of the curious, those who had come to witness the final act of the strange drama that had begun with her arrival. Elena wore the same blue cotton dress she had worn to the sewing circle, freshly washed and pressed. She had woven some late-blooming wildflowers into her hair. Colton stood waiting for her by the altar, looking uncomfortable but resolute in a clean shirt and his best denim trousers. He looked solid, dependable, a rock in a sea of staring faces. When she reached him, he took her hand, his calloused palm enveloping hers, and the whispers in the pews died down. The preacher, a thin, earnest man named Mr. Abernathy, began the service. His words were the familiar, comforting cadences of the ceremony, but beneath them, a current of tension ran through the room. It was then that Agnes Dunham, seated in the front pew, as was her right as the mayor's wife, chose to speak. In a theatrical stage whisper loud enough for the entire chapel to hear, she commented to the woman beside her, "In such a hurry, are they not? One must wonder if they are afraid of missing the stagecoach back east." A few stifled titters broke the solemnity. Elena felt a familiar, hot wave of shame wash over her. Her hand tensed in Colton's. She had thought for a moment that this day would be free of such poison. Colton did not turn. He did not honor the comment with a glance. Instead, he simply moved his other hand and placed it gently on the small of Elena's back. It was a simple, proprietary gesture, an act of silent, public reassurance. It was a shield. It was the echo of his first action toward her in the dusty street, a public declaration that she was his, and he was hers, and the opinions of others were nothing more than meaningless noise. The quiet strength of the gesture calmed the room more effectively than any angry retort could have. The snickering stopped. Agnes Dunham sniffed indignantly and fell silent. They spoke their vows, their voices clear and steady in the now quiet chapel. When Mr. Abernathy pronounced them husband and wife, Colton turned to Elena. He did not kiss her. Instead, in front of the entire town, he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a firm, respectful kiss to her knuckles. It was a gesture of profound tenderness, a promise of partnership and esteem. As they left the chapel, the new Mr. and Mrs. Yancey, a strange thing happened. A few people began to clap, led by the Jenkinses. The applause was scattered at first, then grew, a tentative but genuine show of support from a community that had perhaps, finally decided to judge them on their character rather than on gossip. The feeling of goodwill did not last the afternoon. They had just returned to the ranch when Colton, walking out to check on the new reservoir they had dug, stopped dead in his tracks. He stared for a long moment, his body going rigid. Elena followed his gaze. The trickle of water that fed their precious pool had stopped. The muddy bottom was already beginning to crack under the autumn sun. Without a word, Colton turned and strode toward the barn to saddle his horse. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. "Stay here," he said. His voice clipped. "What is it?" Elena asked, though she already knew. "Tate," he said, "the name a curse. He has damned the creek." Elena watched him ride out, his back straight, a rifle resting in the scabbard on his saddle. The image of the fire, of the fight they had shared, flashed in her mind. She knew he was riding into a confrontation he might not win, a fight Tate had been planning all along. Her first instinct was to obey, to stay where it was safe, but she was his wife now. His fight was her fight. Her place was beside him. But charging after him in a panic would help no one. She took a deep, steadying breath, her mind racing, clicking into the same practical, strategic gear it had found during the fire. She thought of the newborn calves, the ones most vulnerable to the sudden lack of water. Then she thought of the law, of the slow, grinding wheels of justice that Vaughn Tate was so certain he could outmaneuver. She ran to the house, not for a weapon, but for paper and ink. Her pen flew across the page, her handwriting clear and precise despite her urgency. She wrote 2 letters. The first was to Martha Jenkins. She described the situation plainly, without hysterics. "Tate has blocked the creek. The herd is without water, but the youngest calves will be the first to suffer. I know the women of this town have good hearts. Any water that could be spared would be a great act of Christian charity." The second letter was longer, more formal. It was addressed to the county magistrate in the territorial capital. She composed it carefully, drawing on everything she had learned from the books and her late-night sessions with the maps. She laid out the facts of their claim, the history of the property, and the deliberate campaign of intimidation by Vaughn Tate. She cited the Territorial Act of 1864, which guaranteed access to historical waterways for established homesteads. She requested an immediate injunction to have the illegal obstruction removed. It was a long shot. She knew. The circuit judge was weeks away, but it was a shot she had to take. She signed it. Elena Zimmerman Yancey. She saddled Daisy herself, her movements swift and sure. She tucked the letters into her dress and rode not toward the confrontation upstream, but toward town, her mind clear on her purpose. She found Herbert Jenkins at the Mercantile, explained the situation in a few quick sentences, and handed him both letters. "Please see that Martha gets this immediately," she said, "and this one needs to go out on the afternoon mail coach. It is a matter of law. Herbert, it is important." The storekeeper's kind face was grim, but he nodded. "Of course. Elena, Godspeed." With her own missions accomplished, she turned Daisy's head and rode toward the creek, toward her husband. She followed the dry, cracked bed of the stream, a sad testament to Tate's greed. As she drew closer, she heard the angry shouts of men. She dismounted, tethering Daisy to a willow tree, and crept forward on foot, the rifle from the house now held firmly in her hands. Peeking through a thicket of brush, she saw the scene, a crude dam of rocks, logs, and packed earth had been thrown across the narrowest point of the creek, turning the steady flow into a stagnant pool on Tate's side. Colton stood on his side of the barrier, facing Vaughn Tate and 2 of his hired men. "This is my water," Tate Colton was yelling, his voice raw with a fury he was struggling to control. "You have no right." Tate laughed, a smug, ugly sound. "Right is a funny thing. Yancey, it usually belongs to the man strong enough to take it. The law says that creek bed is my property line. I am just improving my property." "You are a thief and a coward," Colton shot back. "Sticks and stones," Tate said with a shrug. "The fact is, your cows are thirsty. Mine are not. We can still make a deal." As the two men were locked in their war of words, Elena saw one of Tate's men begin to circle around, moving behind Colton. He was a big, brutish man, and he was lifting his rifle, not to aim it, but to swing it like a club. He was going to strike Colton from behind. There was no time to shout a warning, no time to think. Elena reacted on pure, honed instinct. She lifted the rifle to her shoulder, just as Colton had taught her. She did not aim at the man. She aimed high, at the vast, empty blue sky. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion of the gunshot was a deafening crack that shattered the tense standoff. Birds erupted from the trees. Tate's man, startled in the act of his cowardly attack, froze and stumbled back. Colton spun around, his own hand dropping to the pistol at his hip, his face a mask of shock as he saw Elena emerge from the brush. The rifle held steady in her hands. "That is enough," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that surprised even herself. Before anyone could react to the new situation, another rider came crashing through the trees. It was Deputy Harlan Pike, his face flushed, his horse breathing hard. The gunshot had done its work. It had summoned the law. The deputy's eyes took in the scene in an instant. The dam, the armed men, Colton's furious stance, and Elena, standing firm with the rifle. "What in blazes is going on here?" he demanded, his voice carrying the weight of his office. "Tate has stolen my water." "Harlan," Colton said, his voice tight, "and his man was about to cave my head in." Tate scoffed. "A simple disagreement over property. Deputy, your arrival is unnecessary." The deputy ignored him. He dismounted and walked over to the henchman who had been about to strike Colton. "Give me your rifle," he commanded. The man hesitated, looking to Tate. "Now," the deputy said, his hand resting on his own sidearm. The man sullenly handed over the weapon. Deputy Pike turned his attention to the dam. He walked its length, his expression grim. "This is an illegal obstruction. Tate, you know that as well as I do." "It is a temporary improvement on my own land," Tate insisted. "It is a criminal act until a judge says otherwise," the deputy countered, his voice hard. He pulled a length of twine and a small paper tag from his saddlebags. He walked to the center of the dam and tied the tag to a protruding log. "This dam is now sealed by order of the territorial court. No one is to touch it, add to it, or remove it, until the circuit judge arrives to adjudicate the matter. Any man who violates this order will be arrested. That goes for all of you." He looked from Tate's angry face to Colton's frustrated one. It was not a victory for either side, but a stalemate. The water was still blocked, but Tate's aggression had been checked by the law. For now. The deputy tipped his hat to Elena. There was a newfound respect in his eyes. "Ma'am," he gathered his horse's reins, "I suggest you all go home and let the law handle this." Tate and his men retreated, muttering angrily. The immediate danger was over. Colton walked over to Elena, his face a mixture of relief, anger, and awe. He gently took the heavy rifle from her hands. "I told you to stay at the house," he said, but there was no heat in his words. "I am your wife," Elena replied simply. "My place is with you." He looked at her steadfast courage, at the quiet strength that had once again risen to meet a crisis head-on. He looked at the sealed dam, a monument to their new and more complicated battle. They had won the skirmish, but the war for Whitetail Creek, and for their future, had just begun. The weeks leading up to the circuit judge's arrival were a quiet, tense truce. The dam remained, a silent monument to Vaughn Tate's greed, and the Yancey Reservoir, fed only by a few meager underground seeps, shrank a little more each day. But help had come in an unexpected form. After Elena's letter was delivered, a slow but steady trickle of wagons made the trip out from town. Martha Jenkins came first, her wagon laden with barrels of water from her own deep well. Then Mrs. Peterson arrived, and others followed. The women of Whitetail Creek, moved by a sense of fairness and community, brought what they could spare, creating a water brigade that kept the Yancey calves alive. It was a quiet rebellion, a statement made not with guns, but with buckets and barrels. The judge, a man named Elias Thorne, arrived in a covered wagon with his clerk and a bailiff, just as the sky to the north was turning a flat, ominous gray. He was a stern, weary-looking man who seemed unimpressed by the raw frontier town. He announced that the hearing regarding the Whitetail Creek water rights would be held the following morning in the town's only public hall, which also served as the saloon. That night, the storm came. It did not arrive gently. It was a sudden, violent assault of wind and snow, a white fury that descended on the valley and erased the world. The wind shrieked like a banshee, piling snow into monstrous drifts against buildings and fences. Whitetail Creek was cut off, a tiny island in a roaring sea of white. Inside their small cabin, a fire blazed in the hearth. The mood was somber. The storm felt like a bad omen. Colton stared into the flames, his face a grim mask of worry. "He will not be able to see the land," he said, his voice low. "How can a man judge a water dispute when the creek and the boundaries are buried under 3 feet of snow?" Elena came and sat beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "The truth does not change with the weather. Colton, our maps, the testimony, it is all still true." As the storm howled into its second day, a frantic pounding came at their door. Colton opened it to find Herbert Jenkins, his face nearly frozen, his mustache caked with ice. "It is Earl," the storekeeper gasped, stumbling inside. Vaughn Tate's youngest hand. He went out yesterday afternoon to check on some stray calves before the storm hit, and he never came back. Tate just rode in, half mad with worry. He has offered a reward to any man who will ride out and look for him. Colton and Elena exchanged a look. It was a fool's errand to go out in the blizzard, a likely death sentence. But the image of a boy, alone and lost in the storm, was a powerful one. "He is just a boy," Elena said softly, her voice full of a pain that was almost maternal. "Tate's boy," Colton said, but there was no venom in his words, only a weary sort of resignation. He was already pulling on his heaviest coat. He would be up in the north pasture, where the land breaks toward the hills. "I am coming with you," Elena said, her tone leaving no room for argument. They packed a small wooden sledge with blankets, a lantern, and a flask of hot coffee. The world outside the cabin was a maelstrom of white. The wind tore at them, stealing their breath, and the snow was so thick they could barely see a few feet ahead. They moved slowly, shouting to one another to stay close, their world reduced to a churning, frozen chaos. It was an act of pure, desperate faith. They found him by chance, a small, dark shape huddled at the base of a rock outcropping that offered scant protection from the wind. He was barely conscious, his face a pale, bluish white. One of his legs was twisted at an unnatural angle. Elena knelt beside him, her skilled fingers quickly assessing the damage through his thick trousers. "It is broken," she said, her voice tight. "A clean break, I think, but we need to get him warm, now." They worked together with the practiced efficiency of a team that had been tested by fire. They gently splinted the boy's leg with a rifle stock and strips of a torn blanket. They forced a few sips of the hot coffee between his chattering teeth. Then, with a great effort, Colton lifted the boy's limp form and placed him on the sledge. They wrapped him in every blanket they had, leaving themselves with only their coats against the storm's fury. The long, brutal journey back was a silent testament to their shared resolve. They leaned into the wind, 2 small figures fighting a great and terrible storm, bound by a simple, unshakable duty to a human life. The trial was convened 2 days later, after the storm had blown itself out, leaving behind a world of pristine, sculpted white and a profound, ringing silence. The saloon was packed. Vaughn Tate sat at a front table with his lawyer. his face pale and strained. His son, Earl, was safe. His leg set by Dr. Miller, but the arrogance had been stripped from him. He looked across the room at Colton and Elena, and for the first time, there was something other than contempt in his eyes. Judge Thorne was all business. He listened to Tate's lawyer present a case built on legal technicalities and the convenient absence of a survey marker. Then he called on Colton. Colton stood, but he gestured to his wife. "My wife, Elena, will present our evidence, Your Honor." A murmur went through the room. Elena walked to the front, her heart pounding but her face composed. She unrolled the large sheet of drafting paper on which she had painstakingly copied the original survey maps and added her own clear, precise notations. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "the claim of Mr. Tate rests on the idea that the boundary is the current creek bed, but our deed, and the original territorial survey, says the boundary is a straight line, marked by a specific point. We believe that point still exists." She called Preacher Abernathy as her first witness. He testified that he had officiated the wedding of the previous landowner, Mr. Miller, under a great cottonwood tree that had stood beside the creek. Then she called a surprise witness, a grizzled old homesteader who had helped Miller build his first cabin. He described the location of the cottonwood in detail and swore that the original survey marker, a large, chiseled stone, had been set at its base. "The flood of 5 years ago took the tree, Your Honor," Elena explained, her finger tracing a line on her map. "But a great stone and a tree's root ball do not simply wash away. We believe they were buried. They are still there, under several feet of silt and mud, right where the old survey says they should be." Her logic was simple, practical, and irrefutable. She had taken a mystery and solved it with research and common sense. Judge Thorne looked at the map, then at Tate. "Do you have any evidence to refute this, Mr. Tate?" Tate said nothing. His lawyer shuffled his papers. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "The Yancey deed stands. The historical boundary is upheld. Mr. Tate, you will remove your illegal dam immediately. You will also pay Colton Yancey for damages and lost revenue, the amount to be determined by this court." The room was silent for a moment, then erupted in conversation. Tate sat stunned, a man defeated not by force, but by a woman's quiet intelligence. Later that afternoon, as the low winter sun cast long blue shadows across the snow, there was a knock at their door. It was Agnes Dunham. She stood on their doorstep alone, without her usual entourage, looking smaller and more uncertain than Elena had ever seen her. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice quiet. Elena, surprised, stepped aside and let her in. Agnes stood awkwardly in the center of the small room, her fine wool coat a stark contrast to the rustic simplicity of the cabin. "I came to apologize," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "What I said at your wedding, what I have said on other occasions, it was cruel. It was uncalled for." She looked at Elena, and for the first time, her eyes were not filled with malice, but with a deep, weary sadness. "I see the way you and your husband stand together. I saw how you helped the Peterson baby, and I heard what you did for the Tate boy." She took a shaky breath. "The truth is, I have been a bitter woman. The doctor told my husband and me last year that I would not be able to have any more children, and I see my own years advancing in the mirror every day, and it frightens me. I took that fear, that bitterness, and I aimed it at you, because you came here and made a new life, and I was afraid my own life was over. It was wrong, and I am truly sorry." Elena was speechless. She saw in this woman not an enemy, but a reflection of her own past fears. She saw a fellow traveler struggling with her own burdens. She stepped forward and, to Agnes's surprise, took her hand. "Thank you, Agnes," she said softly. "I accept your apology." In that moment, a bridge was built over the chasm of bitterness and the foundation for a new community, a more compassionate one was laid. That night, the full weight of the past few days seemed to settle on Colton. The ordeal in the storm had left him with a network of deep scratches on his face and hands from fighting through frozen branches, and a low fever now burned in his eyes. He shivered, despite the warmth from the fire, and finally conceded to Elena's insistence that he go to bed. She cared for him with a quiet, focused tenderness. She bathed the scratches on his face with a warm, clean cloth, her touch gentle and sure. She brewed a hot tea with herbs to bring down his fever, holding the cup to his lips. She sat by his bedside in the dim light of a single lamp, simply being with him, a calm and steady presence. He was not used to being cared for, and he watched her, his eyes full of a deep, unguarded emotion, the last of his defenses, the final ghost of his past sorrows, seemed to dissolve in the warmth of her gentle hands. He reached up and took her hand, his own hot with fever. "Elena," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He did not say thank you. He did not need to. His eyes said everything. They spoke of a profound gratitude, a deep and abiding love that had been forged in hardship and now found its rest in this quiet, peaceful moment. She squeezed his hand gently, a silent response that told him she understood. They were home. They were safe, and they were, finally and completely, together. The winter broke slowly. Then, all at once, the great silent world of white surrendered to the sound of 1,000 trickles of melting snow. The sun returned with a gentle, tentative warmth, and the air filled with the rich, clean scent of damp earth coming back to life. On the Yancey Ranch, the most beautiful sound of all was the gurgle and rush of Whitetail Creek, flowing full and free now that the illegal dam had been torn down. Vaughn Tate, humbled by the court and haunted by the near loss of his son, had complied with the judge's order without protest, sending a team of men to dismantle their crude barrier the day after the trial. Spring was a season of deliberate, hopeful work. Colton and Elena returned to the diversion trench they had dug in desperation. What had been a scar of survival, they now transformed into a work of permanence. They widened it, reinforced the banks with carefully placed stones, and extended it to a series of smaller channels that would water the new vegetable garden Elena had planned. The labor was still hard, but it was joyful. Every shovelful of earth was an investment in a future they had fought for and won. One afternoon, Colton returned from town with a wagon that held not fence posts or sacks of grain, but a half-dozen thin, delicate saplings, their roots carefully wrapped in burlap. "Apple trees," he said, a rare, shy smile on his face. "The man at the freight office said they came all the way from Ohio. Said they are a hardy variety." They planted them together on a gentle slope that caught the morning sun, digging the holes deep and wide, giving the roots room to grow. It was an act of profound faith. An apple orchard was not a crop for a single season. It was a promise made to the years to come, a legacy for a generation they had not yet imagined. Elena's standing in the community had been irrevocably altered. She was no longer the old bride from the East, but Mrs. Yancey, the woman who had faced down Vaughn Tate, saved his son, and won a legal battle through sheer intelligence. When she attended the sewing circle, which had relocated to the Jenkinses' mercantile for the spring, the women listened when she spoke. During one of these gatherings, the talk turned to the fire of the previous autumn and the fear of another dry season to come. "The problem is that each family's hay is stored separately," Elena observed, her needle moving in a steady, even rhythm. "If one barn catches fire, it is a total loss for that family. But if we had a place to store a portion of our hay together, a communal reserve, we could all be protected." The idea, simple and practical, took root. Agnes Dunham, in a move that silenced the room, was the first to support it. "My husband's lumber mill can provide the timber at cost," she announced, her voice its usual commanding tone, but now directed toward a common good, And there is a piece of common land just west of the chapel that would be perfect. Under Elena's quiet guidance and Agnes's formidable organizational skills, the project took shape. The women of Whitetail Creek, who had once been a loose collection of households, became a unified force. They raised funds, drew up plans, and supervised the construction of a large, airy barn. A community hay house, as it came to be called. It was a symbol of their newfound resilience, a testament to the idea that they were stronger together than they were apart. As the days grew longer and warmer, a subtle change began within Elena. It started with a weariness that even a full night's sleep could not erase. At first, she attributed it to the hard work of spring. But then came a morning when the familiar smell of coffee brewing on the stove turned her stomach. A quiet, terrifying, and wondrous suspicion began to dawn in her mind, a hope so fragile she barely dared to give it a name. She said nothing to Colton, not wanting to give him a hope that might be false. She rode into town alone to see Dr. Miller. The gruff doctor listened to her symptoms, his expression unreadable. He asked a few direct clinical questions, then performed a brief examination. He washed his hands at the basin, his back to her for a long moment. "Well, Mrs. Yancey," he said, turning around, his face softened by a look that was almost gentle. "It seems your life here in Montana agrees with you. You are with child." The words hung in the still, sunlit air of the small office. Joy, pure and overwhelming, surged through Elena, so powerful it made her dizzy. A baby, a family, everything she had crossed a continent to find. But the doctor's next words tempered the joy with a cold dose of reality. "You must understand," he said, his voice serious. "You are 36 years old. This is not the same as a girl of 20 having her first. There are risks. Your body will be under a great strain. You must take exceptional care of yourself. No more heavy lifting. No more 18-hour days. You need rest, and you need good, plentiful food. Your health and the baby's depends on it." She rode home in a daze, the doctor's warning echoing in her ears along with the joyous secret she now carried. That evening, she told Colton. She waited until after supper, when the dishes were cleared and they were sitting in the quiet calm of the evening. "Colton," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "we are going to have a child." He stared at her, his face completely blank for a moment as her words registered. Then, a slow, dawning comprehension spread across his features, followed by an expression of such profound, unadulterated joy that it brought tears to her eyes. He reached across the table and took both of her hands in his grip tight, as if holding on to the most precious thing in the world. But as she told him what Dr. Miller had said about the risks, she saw the joy in his eyes become shadowed with a deep, protective fear. The news spread through the community, as news always did, but this time it was not the subject of gossip, but of a quiet, collective concern. The women's sewing circle transformed itself into a support network. The day after hearing the news, Agnes Dunham appeared at the ranch, not with a cutting remark, but with a piece of paper and a pencil. "Martha Jenkins will bring a hot meal on Tuesdays," she announced, with the air of a general organizing a campaign. "The Peterson girl will come on Thursdays to help with the laundry. I will take Saturdays. We will not have you straining yourself. Elena, it is all arranged." It was a miracle born not of heaven, but of the slow, difficult work of human hearts changing. The women who had once whispered about her age now rallied to protect her through the very vulnerability that age presented. The greatest change, however, was in Colton. The doctor's warning had shaken him to his core. The fierce self-reliance that had been his armor for so long now seemed like a dangerous liability. He could not build a new barn or fight a fire to protect Elena from this risk. He had to learn a new way of living, a new way of being a husband. A week later, a young man named Silas, known for being a hard worker, appeared at the ranch. "Mr. Yancey hired me on," he explained to Elena, twisting his hat in his hands. Said he needs an extra hand to see him through the winter. Colton had never had a hired hand before. He had always believed that if you wanted a job done right, you did it yourself. Hiring Silas was an admission that he could not do it all, that he needed help. It was an act of trust and a profound act of love for his wife and unborn child. The final transformation came one evening a few weeks later. Elena was sitting at the table, mending one of Colton's shirts. He came in from the barn and, without a word, placed the ranch's ledger books on the table in front of her. They were thick, leather-bound volumes, filled with his masculine, blocky handwriting, detailing every head of cattle sold, every pound of seed bought. "I have been thinking," he said, his voice quiet. "You understand these things better than I do. The numbers, the planning. From now on, the books are your domain." Elena looked from the ledgers to her husband's face. This was more than just a division of labor. It was the final, complete acknowledgement of their partnership. He was entrusting her with the financial heart of their life, with the official record of the home they were building together. He saw her not just as the woman who shared his bed and his table, but as the co-architect of their entire future. The fear for her health was still in his eyes, but it was now matched by a deep and abiding respect. They were ready to face whatever came next, not as two separate individuals, but as a single, unified whole. The summer months passed in a state of watchful tranquility. The days were long and hot, filled with the steady, peaceful rhythms of a prosperous ranch. The community hay house stood full, a testament to a successful harvest and a united effort. Elena, her body heavy with the promise of new life, moved with a slow and deliberate grace. The women of Whitetail Creek were true to their word, a constant, rotating presence of help and companionship. They brought stews and fresh-baked bread, helped with the mending, and filled the small cabin with cheerful chatter, creating a protective web of community around her. Colton watched over her with a fierce, quiet devotion. He had hired on Silas permanently, and the presence of another capable man freed him to stay closer to the house. He learned to read the subtle signs of her fatigue, to see the faint shadows under her eyes, and he would gently but firmly insist that she rest. The fear for her safety was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of his joy, a fear that made his love for her sharper and more profound. September arrived, painting the cottonwood leaves along the creek a brilliant gold. One evening, the air grew still and heavy, charged with an electric tension. The sky to the west turned the color of a deep bruise, and distant, silent flashes of lightning illuminated the clouds from within. The storm rolled in just after dark, a deluge of hammering rain and spectacular cracks of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. It was in the midst of this elemental fury that Elena's labor began. Colton rode like a man possessed, the wind and rain tearing at him, to fetch Dr. Miller and Martha Jenkins from the town. He returned to find Elena breathing through the pains, her face pale, but her eyes calm and resolute. Martha, a beacon of serene competence, immediately took charge, sending Colton to boil water and keep the fire high. The night became a blur for Colton. He was relegated to the main room of the cabin, pacing the floorboards like a caged wolf. Listening to the muffled sounds from the bedroom, Elena's low groans, Martha's soothing murmurs, the doctor's occasional terse command. The storm outside was a mirror of the tempest in his own heart. He, a man who had faced gunfire and fire and blizzards, had never felt so utterly helpless. The lives of the two people who meant more to him than the world itself were in the hands of others, and all he could do was wait. Just before dawn, as the storm was beginning to spend its fury, a new sound cut through the rumble of the thunder. It was a thin, reedy, and utterly miraculous cry. Colton froze, his heart seeming to stop in his chest. A moment later, the bedroom door opened. Dr. Miller stood there, his sleeves rolled up, looking exhausted, but pleased. "You have a daughter, Yancy," he said, a rare smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "A healthy, noisy little girl, and your wife is a champion. She is tired, but she is well." Colton stumbled into the room. The air was warm and smelled of soap and fresh linen. Elena was propped up on the pillows, her hair damp against her forehead, her face luminous with a weary, triumphant joy. And nestled in the crook of her arm, wrapped in a soft white blanket, was the most incredible thing he had ever seen. A tiny, perfect human being, with a tuft of dark hair and a furious, wrinkled face. He reached out a trembling hand, his large, calloused finger looking impossibly clumsy next to her delicate cheek. At his touch, her tiny mouth rooted for a moment, and a wave of love so fierce and overwhelming washed over him that it brought him to his knees beside the bed. "Catherine," Elena whispered, her voice soft with exhaustion and love. "Her name is Catherine Hope." Hope. The word settled in Colton's heart, a perfect summation of their entire journey. She was the living, breathing proof that a life could be built from courage, that a home could be forged in hardship, and that love could find a way, even in the harshest of lands. A few months later, on a crisp, clear autumn afternoon, a lone rider approached the ranch. It was Vaughn Tate. He dismounted slowly, his movements stiff. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet weariness. Colton met him in the yard, his stance neutral but watchful. Tate did not offer to shake hands. He simply stood there for a moment, looking at the well-tended ranch, at the smoke curling from the chimney. "I have sold off a third of my herd to pay the damages the court ordered," he said, his voice flat. It was not a complaint, just a statement of fact. He looked at Colton, his gaze direct. "I wanted to thank you, and your wife, for what you did for my boy, Earl. The doctor said if you had not found him when you did..." He let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished. "He is a good boy. He is all I have left of his mother." It was the closest the man could come to an apology, a crack in the hardened facade that showed the worried father beneath. "Anyone would have done the same," Colton said. And it was true. "Perhaps," Tate replied. "But you did." He nodded once, a gesture of final, grudging respect, then turned, mounted his horse, and rode away. As he left, a great weight seemed to lift from the valley, the last shadow of their long conflict finally receding. 5 years passed. The apple saplings grew into sturdy young trees that produced small, sweet fruit. The ranch prospered, and the community of Whitetail Creek grew with it, bound by the memory of shared trials and the promise of a shared future. Catherine Hope Yancey grew from a noisy infant into a bright, curious little girl with her mother's steady eyes and her father's quiet determination. The annual Founders' Day festival was in full swing. The entire valley had gathered for a day of games, food, and celebration. Elena stood with Colton, watching Catherine laugh as she played a game of tag with the Peterson children. The years of hard work and good living had been kind to her, but they had left their mark. Streaks of silver now threaded through her dark hair, shining in the afternoon sun. Herbert Jenkins, his own hair now more salt than pepper, came over to them, a wide smile on his face. "Look at you two," he said, his voice full of genuine affection. He winked at Elena. "All that worrying over Colton has given you some very distinguished silver hairs, my dear." It was a gentle, loving joke, the kind shared between old and dear friends. A few people nearby chuckled warmly. Elena smiled, unembarrassed. She felt a familiar, calloused hand slide into hers, his fingers lacing through hers. She looked up at her husband. Colton's face was older now, the lines around his eyes deeper, but those eyes were full of the same unwavering love she had seen on the day she had arrived, a lifetime ago. He leaned in close, his voice a low, warm rumble meant only for her. Yet, in the sudden quiet of the moment, it seemed to carry on the wind. "Timeless," he said always. This time, there was no snickering. There was no scorn. The people standing nearby, the ones who had witnessed their story from the very beginning, simply smiled. A few of them began to applaud, a soft, spontaneous sound that was not for a spectacle, but for a love that had proven its worth. The sound mingled with the laughter of children and the gentle sigh of the wind as it swept across the golden grasslands of the valley. Later that evening, the three of them stood on the porch of their home, watching the sun dip below the purple mountains, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink. Catherine sat on Colton's shoulders, her small hand resting on his head. Elena leaned against him, his arm wrapped securely around her. They looked out over their land, at the peaceful, thriving valley. It was a world born of justice, nurtured by forgiveness, and sustained by a love that knew no age. It was more than a ranch. It was their place, their sanctuary, their home. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know where you're tuning in from in the comments to connect with everyone. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help share this story with more people.